Effectively talking about obviously supplementation, but the last thing I want to make sure we touch upon is contamination. So thanks to the way that nutritional supplements are effectively regulated in the USA, it's really pretty damn bad. In that they're going to be able to effectively, the way they can market and label is not overseen by the FDA, unlike pharmaceutical medications, which there's never any issues with regulation of pharmaceutical products. We don't have an issue with opiates in this country. It's all nothing to worry about. But the issue with nutritional supplements is unless they're being tested by a third party, this could be a number of different outfits that do essentially testing to make sure that what's on the label is inside the bottle. They can make a lot of different claims, which can be easily fraudulent. And there has been a number of cases where supplements were actually contaminated with actual banned substances, meaning actual oral anabolics that have a major effect on performance. And people that thought they were just taking a really good pre-workout or otherwise, they were really taking pro-hormones. And because of that, have a big impact on their performance and obviously are going to be able to do far better in their sporting endeavors than they would have otherwise. But now they're going to fail a drug test. The athletes that fail drugs tests are the ones that it happened on accident. They really didn't know what they were doing. They took something that just happened to be contaminated, or they're the people that were just too dumb to get around the testing. Because passing drug testing, if you know what you're doing, is not that difficult. It just requires understanding the timing, understanding how they're doing collection, what they're looking for, and then playing the cat and mouse game. Sometimes they're using drugs that don't just have a test developed for them. So people will take a drug or a supplement, a steroid really we're talking about here, or otherwise, that there's not a test for, so they can use as much as they want because they're not gonna be able to pick it up in the metabolites. They can also look at things like ratios and otherwise. If you guys want to have a fun conversation about how to pass drug tests, we can go through it any day of the week. It is fascinating because, like anything else, just like good old standardized testing, you teach to the test. So if you know what the test is, you know what you need to do. Now, once again, the people this happened to, it's usually going to be on accident, or they just were really cavalier and not thinking things through. What they're going to do with labeling is they can obviously say that it's got this, but they'll not list the actual dosages. And remember, it's the dosage that has the efficacy or might be a little too harsh on your body. So when you're looking at supplementation, it's really important that you're looking at, okay, how many milligrams of this, how many grams of this are in each serving? So that way, you know, you're effectively getting the dosage that you're looking for, and you're not taking in too little or too much of any supplement out there. And this is sometimes referred to as fairy dusting. This is where you see something like proprietary blend when we're looking at different supplements, and specifically, you know, different supplement companies that are not exactly doing things that well, along with, yeah, there's a number of not very ethical approaches. And obviously it's a lot of marketing. They're there to sell products. They're not there to do a good job. And you see, obviously that's going on right now all the time with people on social media platforms selling their programs, which probably aren't really that good in the first place. And what they're really doing is selling people the idea that they are obviously going to make these progress, but in reality, probably not. So now that I've had some cynicism out there, do you guys have any questions about any nutritional supplements or otherwise anything you want me to go through there before we call it a day on talking about the joys of drugs? Okay. So, there's seemingly no questions about drugs. Let's go ahead and start talking about working with kids. So specifically what's going on with the body when we're obviously younger, and how is that going to influence our decisions we're going to make to how we're setting up a training program, what we're really trying to have them do, what are really our overarching goals. So obviously when we're talking about kids, we're talking about people that are not fully mature yet. Now, growth, development, and maturation are all different things, though they coincide. Growth is obviously increases in size. So this can be overall, this can be obviously different parts of the body. Development is now we're talking about actually differentiation and functional changes. So good old secondary sex characteristics showing up as you get older. And then obviously maturation is now getting into your full adult form. So the way that we tend to group athletes together is based on chronological age. So just how many years, months, and days have you been outside of the uterus for? That is not always a good indicator of what we're trying to work with individuals. Instead, we should look at things like skeletal age and really stage of sexual maturation, because I'm sure some of you guys were at your full height right now when you were 12. Other of you guys were still maturing, getting taller late into your teens, maybe even some of you in your early 20s. So that's going to effectively influence how we're going to train these individuals based upon where they happen to be at. Now, infancy is considered to be your first year. Childhood is until you hit puberty. Puberty is when we have that secondary sex characteristics development. And adolescence is from puberty to essentially the end of growth completion. So however much longer it takes you to hit that maximal height effectively is probably going to be the best way to kind of look at it. And the timing, as far as some folks might actually have their growth spurt and otherwise, and in certain ways mature faster when it comes to the actual developmental changes, but then not fully be through puberty for quite some time. The human body's weird. Easiest way to think about it. But when you're working with middle schoolers, when you're working with high schoolers, you can obviously have a wide variety of individuals that are at different stages in this development, which is going to obviously influence how they're going to respond to training and whatever progress they're going to make. So we talked about body composition before. Like you would expect to see, it turns out we're going to get the greatest amount of height growth really in your entire life is effectively from your birth until about 2 or so years of age. After that, we slow down until we hit puberty. During puberty, you can obviously have that growth spurt, and hence why you see that peak height velocity. So when you're growing at the fastest rate, and after that, we're going to have through the rest, or after puberty, still a little bit of further increase in height, but nowhere near as much until eventually we're going to top out at whatever height we're going to make it. So like anything else, this fastest height tends to coincide with effectively where we hit puberty on average. Females are going to hit this far earlier than males, but like anything else, that's on average. Some folks are going to hit it later, some folks are going to hit it earlier. So just so I don't feel like I'm talking to myself in a room, if you guys get a chance, go ahead and put into the chat effectively at what age you guys were whenever you hit your, effectively you got to the height you're currently at. How old were you? You were a very tall 10-year-old. Either way, that's intense. So in that case, Courtney, you can see how you'd be shifted far to the left. Colleen, you'd be relatively normal. Yeah. Same thing with Holly. Good Lord. Yeah, you guys matured quite early. So you went from being the forward on the basketball team to the point guard as you got older? Now the question is, did you enjoy that period of time where you actually towered over everyone? It's not necessarily that exercise is going to stunt your puberty. It's more or less we're going to be looking at things like how much recovery and then also just good old caloric intake. So obviously growth requires a certain amount of calories. And if you're not getting in enough, part of it due to how many you're consuming through exercise, you're going to potentially not grow as much as you would have. Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed the brief period of time where you got to bully other people. So what is fascinating is while we're going through this growing, our bones are obviously going to be increasing in length, but not necessarily in as great of density as we'd like to see. So actually, when we're going through and we're getting the end of puberty, we still have those growth plates, which is effectively the point where we're expanding those bones from. However, they're not as strong. And because of that, we're actually going to be more likely to potentially risk injury, especially when we hit that second bump that we showed earlier of the peak height velocity. So when you're working with folks and we're effectively thinking they're around puberty, that's actually a good time to think about tapering back your intensity of their maximal strength style training, or just, not that you should be maxing out children in general, that's incredibly dumb, but we'll get into that later. Instead, you want to focus on making sure we're doing a lot of mobility work, making sure that we're also doing some coordination work, seeing as how now that your levers are all getting longer, it can be much harder to obviously effectively feel the position your body should be in when you're doing different endeavors. Now, in general, most women are going to be hitting that essential peak height at a much earlier point. And as we've talked about in biomechanics, you need calcium, vitamin D, vitamin K, and magnesium, and maybe strontium, that's probably more tendon, which are going to be very important for bone mineral density. So this is looking at how dense our bones are. So this is grams of calcium per centimeter cubed. And as we are going up in age, we're going to hit typically a peak bone mass. This is usually tied to where you have your peak strength and everything else. And then it's going to start going down because we're not doing as much, not as much impact. When women hit menopause, it's going to typically go down even further. And hence why, if we don't get a high enough bone mineral density when we're younger and maintain a certain amount of physical activity, we're going to send ourselves into a much higher risk of osteopenia and osteoporosis. Now, muscle mass is typically also going to increase as we go ahead and increase in size. For most folks, it's going to peak somewhere in the late teens, early 20s, obviously, depending on how much training that person is doing. It can obviously peak far later, especially when we're doing a lot of resistance training. The actual long-term research there is not there yet. And like anything else, as far as our increasing our muscle mass is going to be from getting those cross-sectional area increase, along with having longer muscle bellies in general, thanks to that increase in height. Now, in general, we're obviously going to have a certain amount of fat that we're going to be effectively also accumulating as we get older. In general, females tend to have a little bit higher body fat than males, usually in the realm of 6 to 10%. That's not always going to be perfect. It's once we really hit puberty, that's where you see the major difference in body composition between men and women really show up, with the average for females at maturity being about 25 and for males being at about 15. You can see the effects here of puberty driving down body fat, whereas for females, it drives it up typically. And remember, this is all based on averages, but it still gives you some ideas. And what's really interesting athletically before puberty, really it seems to be about age really 12. There's no significant differences between men and women in dang near any physical performance. It's after we hit puberty and we have that major testosterone advantage as males. That's where you're going to see the big differences between the two genders when it comes to performance. Now, as you're growing up, you're learning how to use your body. So hence a big part of going from an infant to a toddler to a child and forward is learning how to use your body, learning how to utilize your musculature to move your body where you want it to be, and obviously to accomplish whatever challenges you give it. May that be anything from running long distance, pitching a baseball, hitting a golf ball, tying your own shoes, and learning how to write. All of those are going to require neurological development. And so this is going to be occurring throughout the entirety of really your entire life, but obviously that happens to typically occur at the fastest rate when you're younger. Because let's face it, guys, you had to learn your first language with not having any other language to help you out. You just had to keep essentially trying and figuring it out with English until you could learn how to speak it, if obviously English is your first language. And I think contextually for those in the class today, that's relatively accurate. So increasing myelination is also going to help with increasing of our ability to recruit muscle fiber, which that improved rate coding and synchronization are going to lead to increases in strength. Now, in general, we're going to see improvements in strength, cardiovascular and respiratory function, and just overall metabolic function, thanks to doing exercise. You're just not going to make as much progress as is going to occur really once you hit puberty. That's where things really tend to increase even more so. So like anything else, when we're really trying to get those maximal performance, we need to effectively have a mature body. And so that's why understanding going for a true, 1 rep max or anything else, we want to learn our sporting skills, but we don't want to specialize too early, except for if you want to be really good at gymnastics, diving, wrestling, figure skating, and potentially golf. Those are the ones that if you don't specialize early in, you tend to never really make up that ground. Most everybody else, the more mixed central challenges they have to their neurological system by participating in a wide variety of athletic endeavors, the better their overall athletic performance is and their decreased risk of injuries as they go throughout life. So specialization is for insects, not for humans. Do keep that in mind. And like anything else, we do seem to see a bigger change effectively in guys when it comes to improvements in the neurological system. Typically around 12, could be a little bit later than that. And whereas with ladies, it tends to be more of a slow, consistent change. But we've got a lot of issues with this data just because this is all based on research that was done in the, for this example, this is going to be coming more from like the 90s, 80s, and 70s. And we definitely had some potentially very different ways that effectively, shall we say, approaches were to physical, to sport participation between the genders. So don't take these as end all be all. Just understand that as kids, you just want to effectively be exposed to a wide variety of athletic opportunities and play, of course. And then from there, as people get older, then we maybe want to focus on specialization, but we just want to have a good foundation of a lot of different challenges for the body. Now, in general, blood pressure is going to be lower in kids, and obviously the hearts are smaller, so we've got a lower stroke volume in general that we're going to get. Obviously, we can see here, guys, the heart rate and then the total oxygen uptake. So you can see the heart rate in boys compared to men is naturally going to be much higher because it turns out the stroke volume is much slower or much lower. We're going to see that in general, it's going to have a lower cardiac output just because it turns out you're not going to be as well trained. Notice how much lower the stroke volume is of a child than an adult, which once again makes perfect sense. And you can see actually a bigger AVO2 difference in essentially kids as opposed to adults. And that's part of the way the body is actually compensating to keep the performance higher. Now, with this basic information, like anything else, well, turns out we're going to find that in general, you're just not as good as you're going to be when you're an adult when you're a child. Go figure. As we're going to go ahead and get older, because we've got a greater amount of lean mass, we're going to be consuming more calories at rest. So hence, we're going to see that metabolic function, that caloric turnover, that resting metabolic rate is going to increase as you get older, as you'd suspect. But we can also easily argue that a lot of kids are going to be far more physically active than most adults are, especially depending on what they do for a career. So you're still going to have the same changes in cardiovascular system when we get into exercise of increasing our heart rate and our stroke volume. In general, you guys can see how we have initial, essentially not really much of a change, but then once we start getting into puberty, we're going to see a pretty large difference in essentially VO2 max. Notice this is total volume of oxygen. Part of this difference is the fact that your average guy is taller than your average girl. Whereas when we're looking at the VO2 relative to body size, we're going to see that difference show up even more so between the two genders as we're getting older. Now, this is mostly coming down to just simply body compositional differences and potentially a little bit with lower red blood cell levels in women due to the monthly phlebotomy schedule that women naturally are on. So in average, if you ever watch a little kid run, you can understand why their economy effort is way worse than an adult. So when you watch a little kid running as opposed to an adult running, there is a reason why they're going to have a much lower economy of effort because they're just not as efficient. They haven't as much practice. And so as we have more practice, we're going to get better at it. We're going to have a longer stride rate and stride length, which in turn, we're going to have much more efficient use of energy. So as we get older, our pace is going to go up, and this is going to maturation. And this is mostly just because, congratulations, we're getting better at running. Now, notice this is not due to we're improving that VO2 max or really that training status. It's once again, we're literally just getting better at running. Now, children in general aren't going to have as much anaerobic capacity as most adults, and that's coming down to really issues with carbohydrate metabolism. So we've got lower stores inside of our cells. We have less enzymes related to it. And like anything else, that means we're going to have lower production and ability to utilize that anaerobic glycolytic system. And we're going to find that the ATP PCR is going to be relatively similar to adults. The key difference is going to be more along the lines of, are we supplementing with creatine? Now, when you see that peak power adjusted for weight, so this can be watts relative to the body weight, we're going to see much higher wattages coming from obviously adults compared to teens, compared to preteens. In general, we're going to see a lot of growth hormone and insulin-like growth hormone being released compared to adults, and we're going to have a greater stress response to exercise compared to adults. Potentially going a little hypoglycemic because it turns out our liver is not as good at freeing up glycogen through glycogenolysis to keep our blood sugar higher. Like anything else, we're going to be utilizing now fat more so than your average adult. And we're going to be utilizing exogenous glucose at a much higher rate. Now, like anything else, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but this is a neat thing to see in that we're going to be actually more reactive to training as a child in certain ways than we are going to be as an adult. So by no means does that mean you need to send your kid off to a training camp if you choose to have them, but more along the lines of understanding that the better the base of fitness you develop as an adolescent, the more or the easier time you can potentially have of maintaining it as we happen to get older. So we're also going to see that our basic acute responses are going to be a bit different than effectively adults, thanks to those metabolic differences that we're going to see. And we're going to see changes in the respiration due to lower lung size. And obviously what we're trying to do when we're working with kids is we're not working at weight control or otherwise, because they in theory should be gaining weight relatively consistently throughout their adolescence as they're obviously increasing body size, but more making sure that we're obviously making those individuals be effectively, as healthy as they can be. So really trying to focus on developing the individual so that they have a good base of physical fitness and hopefully enjoy physical activity. So obviously childhood obesity, like all obesity, is on the rise. It's a multimodal reason for this, as far as, obviously we can talk about caloric balance. We can talk about the prevalence and ease of access of very calorically dense and essentially hyperpalatable foods. And then obviously the lack of physical exercise. You can talk about, different opportunities depending on where you live as far as to be physically, physically active, and some gender disparities that still exist to this day. So strength training has been controversial, that if you lift weights, you're going to stunt your growth, which explains why people never talk about how that's a real, strong farm boy or that person's corn fed, etc. Physical exercise is absolutely fine, specifically doing weight training. The key is, like anything else, the dose that makes the poison, and doing anything that effectively is trying to max out their strength as a child is pretty darn dumb. In that our goal when we're working with kids, it should be to teach them how to do the movements, how to do them safely and correctly. So that way they can have a positive relationship with this physical activity, as opposed to trying to max people out when we've already talked before about the skeletal limitations. And especially if we're going through that peak height velocity, congratulations, now we're risking injuring someone so they could say they benched 135 in middle school. We're not really doing ourselves any favor. Our risk reward ratio is completely inverted. So like anything else, we want to make sure that we're creating good relationships with physical exercise. And the big key is making sure that we've got good technique. In fact, Olympic lifting internationally in some foreign countries, they do have Olympic lifting competitions for kids, but the weights on the bars are very low, and instead they're judged on how perfect their technique is. And that's effectively how someone is going to have a better ranking than another. And just because we have different age numbers here. Remember, this chronological. We want to base it on maturation. So if you've got a 12-year-old man, feel free to go ahead and start hitting the weights heavy and hard. If you've got a 18-year-old boy, well, let's be smart here. Let's not worry about chasing numbers and risking injury, because they have the rest of their life to go ahead and be successful in whatever endeavor they're putting themselves into. So we're going to see, when it comes to aerobic performance, we're not really getting a whole lot of change in VO2 max. It might improve just simply through weight loss if we're talking about obese child to start. And a lot of this is just because we're going to become more efficient at our running. Now, as we become adolescents, now we're going to see changes in our heart and our stroke volume, which is going to help performance. And in general, anaerobic training is going to help with overall enzymatic changes in the storage components. And like anything else, we can use a lot of the same type of programs that we'd use with an adult. The key is, let's not start off with a massive amount of volume. Let's focus on doing a small but essentially consistent amount of work, and then slowly increasing that with time as the child's work capacity improves. So when we talk about that enhanced motor ability, we literally get better at using our own muscle mass and effectively putting our body in the correct places to solve the problems of sport more efficiently as we're younger. Now, another big component is obviously, in theory, we're going to be more active, so we're giving ourselves more changes that are in turn going to help us with improvements in our skills there. Now, in general, the reason why we see this earlier plateau in performance from women is usually due to increased estrogen, causes increased fat deposits, which can lead to a decrease in overall performance, just because, like anything else, in certain athletic endeavors, obviously adipose isn't doing you any favor. So, and if an individual is not being physically active, that's where we're going to have even more issues with that motor abilities. So it is important to make sure kids are being physically active and doing things, once again, they enjoy. That's going to allow them effectively to have the best performance they can. Now, these are older data on, sit and reach, flexed arm hang, mile run. This is that good old President's physical fitness exam, which has a number of flaws to it, but it at least gives you some basic benchmarks of where you're typically going to find normal performances at different age groups with different individuals. Like anything else, don't really think of them as benchmarks we should really even give a damn about. Instead, think of this as like, yeah, this is where the data once was, but it's still more important to just look at, are we making overall general improvements in health and performance as individuals are getting older, or are we going to effectively hit a point where it's like, okay, we're not really making any more progress? So this is, see the 100-meter swim, 400-meter swim, 100-meter run, and then the 1,500-meter run, where you see the younger ages, we don't really see any difference. We do so in the 100-meter, but we see that difference become more prevalent in some events as individuals are getting older. Now, also, those are world records. So some keys to keep in mind is actually due to the way children are effectively built, we're going to have a greater potential issue with thermoregulation. So literally, because that surface area to mass, we're not able to sweat as much. So we're not going to do as well in heat as a young person will, or sorry, as an older person will. And like anything else, we can have greater amount of conductive heat gain just from what we're touching, thanks to essentially that surface area ability. So just be smart. If it's too hot, it's too hot, making sure that water is always accessible, breaks are frequent, and that obviously we're not doing too much in the first place. So in general, we're not really seeing major effects of rational amounts of training on growth. Like if you're doing insane amounts, absolutely. It's going to be more of affecting weight and body comp. If we're going with higher intensity, tend to be a little bit essentially lower. Either peak height velocity and otherwise doesn't seem to be too terribly influenced, unless once again we have issues with excessive exercise and underfeeding, which is unfortunately something that happens in a number of different sports when they're being poorly coached and managed. And how soon we're going to mature shouldn't be really being influenced also again by being physically active. The reason I make that illusion if it shouldn't happen, and it rarely does, is there are examples from essentially delayed puberty, and typically it's going to be athletes that are doing crazy volumes of training like gymnasts, where they're effectively your elementary, middle school, high school gymnast is essentially training gymnastics almost like a full-time job, like putting in nearly 40 hours a week into that training. And then they can have some coaches that are D-bags, giving them essentially telling them not to eat this, not to eat that, not to gain weight. And so from there, we actually can have a suppression of both peak height and of physical maturation. So any questions, comments, concerns when we're talking about kids as far as what we're looking at, potential issues and otherwise? Anything you guys would like me to talk on a little bit more? Okay. So let's go ahead and have ourselves a little bit of fun. And we'll divide you guys up into, let's go, yeah, we'll go 3 separate groups. Okay. So group 1 has a rugby player. Group 2 has a cross-country skier. And then group 3 has an MMA athlete. I want you guys to give me 2 different legal supplements you would have them use and 2 that are illegal. So it's 1:59 now. We're going to go ahead and give you guys, yeah, let's go 5-6 minutes for you guys to kind of go through and come up with what you think you would have them use and why. And then we'll go ahead and call it a day. So the rooms are open. Have some fun. And I will see you guys back here in a few minutes. All right, are you guys having issues with getting over into the other room? All right, folks. We're waiting for the other group to get fully back in here. I want you guys to go ahead and paste in what you guys came up with into the chat, or you guys can go ahead and just unmute and talk through what you guys came up with.
Okay, so I was in group 1 and we had the, let me look in the chat. We had the rugby player. Okay, so I was thinking definitely beta blockers because mainly of the hand stability. I feel like that's going to be really important in rugby because don't you like throw a ball, don't you? Or is that do you kick it? I'm sorry, I'm confused.
No. You do throw the ball, but you also kick the ball. But keep in mind, beta blockers are going to limit your maximal heart rate and your maximal power outputs. So what you might gain in coordination, you're going to lose in your ability to literally hit somebody and or be hit.
Okay, so not that one then. I'm thinking caffeine and then just the, let me see what it's called. Anabolic steroids for them.
Yes. That would be a good illegal choice because it turns out a stronger, more powerful athlete.
Yeah, for the illegal ones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For the legal ones, I feel like creatine is gonna be good.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe like amino acids.
Yeah, and
Is it
caffeine is legal. You can use
you-
caffeine.
Oh, okay, okay. I wasn't sure which one it was. I thought like I know like caffeine is legal, but I wasn't sure like over a certain amount if it's like illegal. I don't know. I'm
Yes, it
sorry.
is in Olympic competition and certain competitions, true. But the big thing is more if you pop for a drug test with this, will you be essentially suspended from participating in your sport? So for them, yeah, steroids, growth hormone might be useful just to help with recovery.
Yeah.
And then, I imagine if you were on cocaine running down a field hitting somebody, that could make you terrifying. So no, that's good. That's good. So Curtis, what group are you in, buddy? Curtis? Thank you. So for the MMA athlete, potentially anabolic agents, blood doping, EPO could be potentially useful. Obviously, you get MMA fighters that fail drug tests relatively frequently for using anabolics. Creatine protein powder, yes. Caffeine could potentially be useful here as well, because it does help decrease sensation of pain. Cross-country skier from Abby, because she sent it to me privately. Caffeine in the form of coffee or possibly creatine supplementation. Now remember, creatine is going to cause improvements in that shortest energy system, which you don't really use much in long distance, as well as it causes increase in lean mass and really water retention. So it actually makes you heavier. So creatine is actually a bad choice for your long distance athlete. Beta alanine could be potentially useful there as a legal choice. As well as, let's face it, supplementing with carbs during might be an advantage. Illegal amphetamines, yeah. Blood doping, absolutely. Erythropoietin would be another potential one. Anabolic steroids, not so much. It can help with recovery, but once again, if people are using excessive amounts of it, they might get to be too big and make it so effectively they're not going to be able to perform as well. So, hey, good job. It was meant to be kind of a quick and dirty, kind of thinking our way through of how things are going to work. What questions, comments, concerns do you guys have for me? Because otherwise, next time we meet, we're going to go ahead and talk about the other end of the spectrum of what happens when you're really old. So old. Turns out things don't work as well. You got to go a little bit slower. You can still make progress, but we do have a genetic ceiling. So, any other questions, comments, concerns?
I had a question about the critical power lab that's due this week.
Yeah, what's up?
So in the methods part, it talks
Mhm.
about adding a certain load per kilogram of body weight.
Yes.
And if we're using one of the bikes at one of the stationary bikes at the rec,
Mhm.
what resistance then do we use?
Um,
Or how would we calculate that?
Absolutely. So the idea with the critical power is it's effectively 3 minutes all out. So nearly any resistance will take care of that as long as it's a legitimate resistance. So figure, just as a simple little rule of thumb, whenever you start pedaling against it, you should think this is going to suck. So
Okay.
if you're sprinting and it's just there's no resistance whatsoever, then yeah, you can go pretty fast and it's relatively easy. You want to have something that's obviously forcing you to work. The critical power test on there is the actual homogenized, that way when we compare this team's numbers to this team's numbers, we can compare it to also the numbers that are in the peer-reviewed literature. Whereas you guys, we're going to have more okay, here's what I did based on this thing, but we're just trying to do the best we can, obviously getting through the pandemic. So yeah, just pick a resistance on there that's relatively high and go, like I said, as hard as you can for 3 minutes. And
Okay.
if you're going to do that on the Airdynes, where it's the push with your arms while you're pedaling with your legs, that thing only has one resistance, and that resistance is pain. So you just go in there as hard as you can and hold on for as long as you can.
Got it. Thank you.
Hey, good question, Jessica. Any other questions? Anything going on? Just make sure we stay on top of the quizzes. You're gonna record what that final wattage was going to be, what you effectively were able to average for that last 30 seconds. So, but yeah, we will go ahead and go through that and yeah, take it from there. But stay safe out there, guys. I'll see you guys on Friday. And I am going to put up, you know, a little homework quiz over these 2 chapters. I'm still writing them for effectively, you know, training with youth and training with, you know, older populations. And obviously we probably won't have that incorporated too much into the quizzes, but there will definitely be questions on that on your final exam. So take care of yourselves, guys. Stay safe out there, and I will see you guys on Friday. So bye-bye.